This Shipchat is a request by Navarch Tully DT. Sorry about the long wait, we got there eventually. He requested this quite some time ago, but because this is of course part of my Romulan month, I thought I'd save it up till now, so sorry about that. Thank you very much. Alright, at the request by Tully DT, we're taking a look at the Romulan Aelahl class. I believe that's what it's called. Aelahl. Aelahl sounds better. It comes off easily off the tongue. I've been watching way too much Vikings, clearly. Pronouncing what is clearly a Saxon name. Anyway, it's a ship from Star Trek Online. And, you know, that can be pretty hit or miss. But we'll take a closer look at it and see, you know, really what the damage is. So it's developed by Cryptic Studios for Star Trek Online. Now, they describe it as a light Warbird battlecruiser, and that's a whole kettle of fish that we'll have to deal with. In terms of the original concept art, it was drawn up Hector Ortiz, I believe that's how his name's spelled. And really one of the interesting things when he said he was designing it was that he was aiming to compete with kind of modern sci-fi. He didn't want to kind of stick to the legacy aesthetic. He wanted to compete with modern sci-fi ships, which, you know, we all know what that kind of hyper sleek, stylized design, very exaggerated, very accentuated, or at least one school of sci-fi design. Then you've got kind of more hard sci-fi design, but obviously he's going after that more kind of organic look, which you get in a lot of particularly high sci-fi, we'll call it. The model was then created by Adam Gibson, and really the result we have, kind of just right off the bat, it's a very sensible design. I'm not really able to poke many holes in it, nor there are some ships in Star Trek Online and some Romulan ships which are quite overblown and crazy. I'm looking at that Hakonia dreadnought thing, or the some of the kind of Borgified looks, which are, you know, like I say, pretty hit and miss. This is a very solid and very sensible design that takes the Romulan look in the right direction, as far as I'm concerned. So we'll get into its in-universe story. So it was developed by the Romulan Republic, and already that kind of places certain limitations in terms of what they could really do. You will obviously notice it is much smaller than the Diduridax. It's 780 meters long. It's quite a lot smaller than the Diduridax. And that obviously is reflective of the limited resources and capabilities of the Romulan Republic. It's also smaller, it's more, so you can build more for less, and it's more designed with a defensive mentality. And I know I'm kind of repeating myself with a bit of a broken record there, because I said the exact same thing about the Damar class. What I would say, though, is that that's just indicative of the trauma of the Dominion War, and then in the case of the Romulans, particularly Hobus. I would actually say that prior to Hobus, Romulan ship design was going in a very different direction, and I will talk about that. So the Aelahl is a replacement for the Diduridax. But actually, viewing it in that way, you're kind of skipping a generation. It is not the direct descendant of a Diduridax, although it does have some overlap and it's a real mishmash. Because essentially between the Aelahl and the Diduridax is the last generation of Imperial ships, that being the Nirexan, Valdor, Mogai, called various things, but that ship, which is a very light, very maneuverable, sort of battle cruiser style Warbird, you have that, and then you have the Kachan, Kirchan, which was a much heavier, much larger, dedicated battleship, and it is very much worth pointing that out, because basically what you have with that generation is you have a splitting of tasks. So the Mogai takes on most of the kind of mixed roles. It performs most of the sort of general purpose roles, patrol, exploration, that kind of thing. And the Kirchan is kept back as a battleship and is kept away from the front line and, kept away from prying eyes up until they're actually going to use them. So that's one thing to take into account, is that you're splitting the duties of the Diduridex. Let the Nurexen be a workhorse and let the Kerchan be the battleship for when you need the big guns. Now, because of the Hober supernova, the yards around Romulus were destroyed, and that meant basically no more Kerchans. That's not the only reason that the Aelahl replaces the Kerchan, but it's one of the reasons. The infrastructure to build stuff like the Kerchan was destroyed, and it wasn't really deemed worthwhile rebuilding it elsewhere, and we'll get into that. But first, I would say it's worth saying that the Aelahl but because of that, the Nurexen was far more prolific than the Kerchan, and as a result, the Aelahl shares much more in common with the Nurexen design. It has very similar weapon pods, if not identical. You've got 2 large underwing weapon pods. Each have 3 emitters, which you can see. It also then has 2 more weapon pods on the wingtips. This is practically identical to the weapons configuration on the Nurexen, albeit significantly upscaled for more powerful weapons because this is a larger, heavier vessel. But essentially what it means is that it takes on the ability to engage smaller vessels, because rather than having just single point-mounted disruptor cannons, disruptor turrets like on the Diduridex, what you ended up with on the Nurexen was variable rates of fire. So you could fire your disruptors at lower rates of fire, but with much more powerful shots, and use that to engage battleships and other large vessels. Or if you're chasing after scout ships and you just need to put out a large barrage of fire to take out swarms of Jem'Hadar fighters, you can set it to a lower power setting and just blaze away with your weapon pod. So that was why it was so advantageous, and that's why it's carried through onto the Aelahl, aside from the fact that there were also plenty available. And again, much like the Nurexen, the Aelahl, yes, it is a larger vessel, it is heavier, but there is a much greater focus on agility, which is a historic weakness for the Romulans. The Romulans have always struggled with mobility and speed, and the Aelahl kind of aims to not fully correct it, but balance out that inequity. So it arguably represents a evolution in the Warbird concept. It is a Warbird, clearly, but it is taking a lot of different aspects from previous designs, merging them together to create a kind of new sort of Warbird, and very different from the original concept back in the early 24th century. It has plenty of Diduridex DNA. It's got that double hull, although it is and the reason it kept the double hull, because it is very stripped back. You might say, why did they bother? But because it's very good for your stealth and long cruisers. You basically have the warp engines on your center line of mass, and that enables your ship to very comfortably sit in the warp field. You're not going to go fast, but you're going to cruise very comfortably and very efficiently, which is the main thing for the Romulans, because you have the cloak. And the other aspect is it helps with the cloak because it helps to kind of contain the warp field as well, so you kind of won't appear as easily. Now, that being said, it preserves that double hull, but as I say, it strips it back as well. And what that does do is it keeps a lot of those advantages, but it means that the ship possesses a bit of lean in the warp field. A lot of the mass of the ship is lent forward, and that does give you some agility, some of that which is very kind of common on Klingon designs. So it's taking on those aspects. It's much more reactive and responsive at warp speeds. So it has a very lightened profile compared to the Diduridex. In that way, it's got a lot in common with the Nurexen, but actually still doing a lot of the same things that the Diduridex was doing, but, in a much sleeker, faster profile. It also actually makes use of the same singularity cores of the Diduridex. Let's be frank, the Diduridex is by the 25th century an old design. and getting quite long in the tooth. It's quite heavy and quite slow. But the core is, well, I say the core is good. The core is still functional. And this is a problem the Romulans have, because quantum singularities keep going. You can't deactivate an artificial quantum singularity once you've initiated it. And if left unattended, it can have some very unfortunate consequences. So, basically, the Romulans, the Romulan Republic, they're, hard up for resources anyway. They don't really want to operate these very old and very resource-intensive Dedurridexes. So they decide, let's take these cores that are still functioning, rip them out, and smack them in the Aelahl. And it's great. It gives the Aelahl a lot of power. It's got all the advantages of a quantum singularity. You don't need to refuel. You can fly for as long as you like, under cloak, at a consistent warp speed. And that gives you a lot of flexibility and range, particularly when you are a big sort of a nomad state. Now, there is some problems. The core in the Dedurridex is very large, and in the Dedurridex it was housed in a very bulky wing section, which the Aelahl foregoes, and that kind of results in the core being partially exposed. You can see that blue cylinder in the back. That is a problem, but given that you are a smaller, more agile target, you've also got better shield systems, the rest of the ship is heavily armoured, you can get away with it. Now, the other kind of interesting evolution, in as much as it a departure from being the primary Romulan warship, the primary Romulan Warbird, it takes a departure from the Kerchan, as I previously said. The Kerchan was a dedicated torpedo cruiser. Basically, with the Kerchan, a Sovereign, an Akira, and a Dedurridex have a menage a trois, and it results in the Kerchan. You have something that is much lighter and more agile, like the Sovereign, compared to its previous counterpart, compared to the Galaxy or the Dedurridex in the Kerchan's case. And then you have the torpedo-heavy armament of the Akira. The Romulans really like the torpedoes because it enables them to fight at long range, which has always again been a bit of an issue. Disruptors are great, they're very powerful, but they require you to get in close. And the Romulans are still happy to do that, but if they can have a ship that also sits at long range, it doesn't have to be the most maneuverable thing, but it is fast, so it can get out of dodge if anyone tries to close with it. The Kerchan could just pelt the enemy with torpedoes. The point being that the Kerchan was a torpedo-heavy vessel. And that was fine when the Romulan Empire was a thing and you had plenty of resources to supply that kind of vessel. Torpedoes, be they plasma, photon, quantum, whatever your torpedo ordnance is, torpedoes are expensive, they are finite, they take time to produce. And you need the facilities to produce them and, reload your vessel. You do not need the same for disruptors. A ship can power its disruptors on its own, and that is why disruptors really became the primary weapon for the Romulans after Hobus, because they are less resource intensive, they are more reliable, they are easier to come by and sustain that capability. Torpedoes, and particularly a torpedo cruiser, is a nice to have, but not an essential. And again, this is part of the reason why the Aelahl leans more to a disruptor armament, and also why you don't see as many Kerchans, because it's just difficult to operate a torpedo cruiser when you don't actually have the infrastructure to replenish a torpedo cruiser anymore. So overall, when it comes to the Aelahl, the design really fits with the more dispersed state that is the Romulan Republic. It's, scattered colonies. The state is very decentralized, and they are very vulnerable to pirates, be that Elachi, Tholians, so on and so forth, in the crazy world that is the 25th century. Essentially, you've got all the range capabilities of the Dedurridex, or any Warbird, frankly, because it's got the quantum singularity, combined with a good cruise, which means it can travel a long way stealthily, and an ability to accelerate to attack speeds very quickly as well. and that gives you a lot of, and so that means that you're very able to rapidly respond to pirate raids and incursions. Again, I find actually that's, in that way, it's got a lot in common with the Klingon Boreth, which, interestingly enough, was designed to respond to Romulan raids back in the early 24th century. But again, I'm getting off topic. Ultimately, what we see here compared to the Diduridex, which was very much focused on being a strategic threat to Romulus's enemies and thus an asset to Romulus in the strategic diplomatic realm, the Aelahl kind of departs from that. It's much more defensive in its mindset. It's much less of a strategic weapon and much more of a hunter-killer. It's not designed to threaten enemy planets or facilities. It's not designed to pose a strategic threat. It is designed to engage and defeat any kind of starship that might threaten Romulan colonies. And in that way, we kind of see why it's both a Warbird, because it's still got that Warbird capability of long-range travel. It's got a very complete set of a suite of capabilities. It's got all the typical amenities and capabilities that you would expect on a Diduridex. Of course, in a more compact profile, smaller crew as well. But it is more intended to engage enemy vessels and be agile, and ultimately it's a lightened version of the Diduridex, or a lightened descendant of the Diduridex. Technically, it's, as I say, it's got a lot more in common with the Nyrexen. So in that way, it's the battleship to the Nyrexen's battle cruiser. You can get really into the weeds when it comes to these technical definitions, as I'm sure you've all seen. But ultimately, it is representative of a much more defensive, inward-looking Romulan Republic. Now, that being said, it is a very capable vessel. Certainly, it's a very strong replacement for the Diduridex. Despite the significant emotional event that was Hobus, unlike the Klingons, who, after Praxis, kind of technological stagnation, the Aelahl is a demonstration that the Romulans still maintain a lot of their technical proficiency and the ability to build modern, up-to-date starships, albeit on a tighter budget. But it is a very competitive design in that respect. And like I say, departs from older Warbirds, but the reason it does that is because ultimately it is a modern ship for the modern age. Thank you all for watching. See you all next time.